Thanks, Abby.
Okay. Could I ask a question real quick?
Yes.
So if I'm not talking, should I hit mute?
Not unless there's something sonic happening in your space.
Okay.
I think it's cool if we just like leave it. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, so my background is the current project that you mentioned in my bio. And so like it's a triptych. So I'm just going to move sideways so you can kind of see. Let's see, this panel is about fashion, and then there's the iconic napalm girl in the center, and then the striking garment workers on this screen here. So it's a triptych. And I think I chose this image as a kind of response to the prompt that you both gave us in terms of, what animates our practice. And I think that this was kind of like a leaping off point for me in terms of having made single channel works for decades and decades. And then finally at this moment, finding myself in a gallery space. So this is an installation shot at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery here. And the show unfortunately was cut short by COVID-19. So it will be traveling in December to the USC's Pacific Asia Museum. Anyways, the whole conversation is really an intersecting conversation about, as you mentioned, fashion, the Vietnam War, and striking garment workers. So I think that's about it. I'm going to say for the image itself right now, and we can definitely pick it up later. The other thing that I should correct is in the bio, you had mentioned that Corey is the first video in the Blindness series. It's actually the third. Okay. But when we had been talking on the phone, it was the first one that I made out of graduate school. So
okay,
I think
got it. That's where it was getting confused.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit, just to dig a little bit deeper into this before we move on? Can you speak a little bit about how the work that you're doing now actually relates to the Blindness series and the earlier work that you'd been doing?
I don't know if there's really clear-cut direct connections, but I think my work has always been kind of preoccupied with immigrants and immigration, and I think all of that for me, personal history, having lived through the Vietnam War and then fled during the fall of Saigon. And so I think that is kind of picked up in this particular piece. I think in terms of my own teaching, the history of labor, the labor movement, and the long 70s itself, which I'm really preoccupied with at the moment. And also in terms of trying to tell the story of my mother's life as well, right? Like it's sort of like I'm calling it my long 70s trilogy too, in terms of talking about the immigrant experience, coming over, connecting that to labor history, and then something else will come of it. So that's sort of tangentially how they connect. In terms of vision, I'm not quite sure that they really actually directly connect, but I think just the spirit of experimentation and kind of, as you've already noted earlier when we were talking, in terms of going from kind of a stream of consciousness from this topic to that topic, sort of bringing everything together, which is sort of how the Blindness series also addresses a number of disparate topics that are then brought under a particular umbrella too.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. Let's move on to Roddy. Roddy, you're going to share your screen with us, right? With an image from our broad prompt, or do you not want to do that anymore?
No, I can. I don't remember getting the prompt, but
we can. Well, we'll just freestyle. Okay. We'll be very impromptu here. Yeah. We'll make it work.
I want to say this isn't my quarantine hair. It's kind of close to my normal hair. Yeah, I mean, I watched the panel yesterday, and so I saw the thing with the virtual backgrounds, and I didn't have the technical chops to get it. But I was thinking about an image that related to, being in New York during the pandemic and being in the epicenter and sort of riding it out with my family, just how kind of, terrible and horrific and, every kind of permutation of emotion, to then, the killing of Mr. Floyd and everything going on. So I was trying to think of an image related to that. And it made me think back to the 90s. And in particular, I think work that was critical of the media and of representation and appropriation strategies. So I thought of, different people. I was thinking of ACT UP and Grand Fury and these types of people, but I settled on a Barbara Kruger image, which, oops, maybe I can do it, which basically was an installation piece. And I thought that the text kind of summed up some of what I was thinking about. Like, all violence is the illustration of a pathetic stereotype. And the original version, I think, of that had a lot of sort of inflammatory sort of racial stereotypes, across, above and below it. And I think this is a different version of it. And so I think, the idea around dialogue and communication, which seems to be happening now with the protests, which is a good sign, and I was thinking a lot about image making in terms of that, that back in the 90s, the first, and Spencer's work definitely is part of this, the idea that the video camera became a tool, and that, in fact, at the ACT UP events or things like that, or activist events, if you had a video camera, it was a powerful sort of device to document stuff. And, the fact that this situation is spawned by another type of image is, with the cameras, is kind of a weird circularity to that. And so, and I remember being at some demonstrations in New York where all of a sudden the police got smart to that and just started smashing the cameras and taking the cameras. But there was a good year or two or so where you had a camera, all of a sudden it changed the dynamic of things. So I was just thinking of an image in relationship to what was going on when we were having the discussions whether we should have this panel or not with what was happening, to see the sort of tenor of what was going on. And I do think, how art and media making affects change in culture, that it is a key kind of element in the dialogue of all this stuff. I think it is one of the ways that change can happen quicker, I think, than maybe politics or other types of social change, So I think media is kind of key. So that's what I was thinking about in terms of that.
And actually, when I'm looking at that image, I'm actually, just to kind of go a little bit deeper into that, with the film that we have in the series, Some Divine Wind, violence and stereotype, like stereotype is very much there working its way through the film and kind of like pushing in and out of it. And violence is always also kind of like nascently there as well. I'm just wondering if those were things that you were thinking about when you were working through Some Divine Wind.
Oh, that's a long time ago.
Long time ago. I mean, are there things that you're thinking about now, or are there things? I mean, when you watch the film, even as a distant spectator now that it's been a while.
Yeah, I mean, there's a funny thing. When it played at MoMA, it was the first night, and my cinematographer who shot it actually came in from San Francisco, and it was the first time I'd watched it with an audience in, I don't know, 20 years. And as I was walking up to do the Q&A with her, I invited her to come up. I said, "Oh my God, I'm so shocked at how bad of a director I was with actors." And she said, "You don't remember?" And I was like, "What?" She said, "You had this whole idea to do this Fassbinder, stagey, theatrical thing, and then as the film went on, the acting would get better." I was like, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah, that's it." But I think one of the things in that film was really, and Rhea and John talked about this a little bit yesterday in their panel. At that time, I think in the 80s was really the boom of Asian American cross-cultural comedies, or Asian comedies rather. around, and they were always around food and all that type of stuff. And so, I was really thinking when I didn't do that film for several years because I didn't really want to do a film about Asian American subject matter. But the story, which was based on a true story, kept sort of coming back to me. So, it was really like this thinking of, are we reifying these stereotypes, or within the own practice, and how do you sort of work against the grain, or how do you address history, and I think it was in the air a lot. I think everybody's work, that's in the series, and I would say, even though we're talking about films from a certain time period, I think everybody has continued that practice in different variations, even now. So I think it was a key moment, in terms of that, to think about media representation, to think about turning image making back against itself. And I think that's where the appropriation stuff was kind of key, I think, with Barbara Kruger and, even Richard Prince and these types of people. And people were doing it in film, certainly, too.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Thank you. I'm not sure. We have our last two panelists without backgrounds. I guess we'll start with you, Spencer. We were talking about your lack of background, thinking through maybe what do you want to tell us? What is that white background? What can fill it?
I'm actually glad I didn't get the memo, because I don't know what I would have come up with for what do you call it, a virtual background. I'm also glad that the two folks went before me, because it gave me some ideas. Actually, Roddy, it's kind of that whole thing of the 90s. And if I look, even though I think I started filmmaking in 1980, but it's the 90s when I actually started working with kids and giving them camcorders and stuff. And if I remember right, there may be some people, some participants. I think Dave Kakashiba might be here with East Bay Asian Youth Center. He's actually run East Bay Asian Youth Center in Oakland for probably 40 years. And he was the one that actually introduced me to Kelly Loves Tony. But if I'm not mistaken, the reason why I actually got my job in the Tenderloin, it was to actually teach kids the video. And if I'm not mistaken, that funding actually came post Rodney King. And the whole money was kind of flooding into the hoods. And basically my program was keep kids off the streets. And so that's sort of when I first met Don Bonus, and the rest is sort of history. So I didn't really think about it until Rodney kind of brought it up, but yeah, that whole kind of camcorder revolution, and putting the voice into the giving ordinary people a voice, as opposed to the filmmaker or the artist being the all-knowing. That was sort of the beginning of that. But that whole springboard actually came out of Rodney King.
Interesting, yeah. And Amit, are you still with us?
I am here.
So we have no face, we have no background, but would you like to tell us what your virtual background would be if you had one?
Yes, I actually had decided I wanted, because Abby told me that I could play a scene on loop. So I had actually chosen the climactic scene of Pyasa, which is the great masterpiece of Indian cinema. Translation is Thirst by Guru Dutt, from like the golden age of Bollywood. And the scene is interesting because it shows, it's the story of a poet and a prostitute. And through a long, kind of braided accidents and different circumstances, the poet appears at his own funeral. And this climactic scene is the moment that the poet is actually both dead and alive. That was going to be on loop, but you
And that
can't
was
see
going to
the
be a
scene
loop.
behind
And
me.
what was that? And what was that for you? What was that kind of bringing forth? What was that animating?
I've been thinking about being, at least tonight, the only South Asian representative, and actually being in that situation, in that position quite often with the East Asian community. I've been represented by a gallery, empty gallery in Hong Kong for a while. So I often find myself in this position. And so that naturally leads me to the question is, I'm very interested in kind of pan-Eastern thought. Is there pan-Eastern thought? What is the, you know what I mean? Is there pan-Eastern, is there Eastern solidarity? Is there some commonality between all of the Asian communities? And so when thinking about Eastern type stories, I was trying to think of Indian cinema in particular, and I was trying to pick a scene where anytime you talk to people about Bollywood or Indian cinema, they almost always say Satyajit Ray and his Apu trilogy, which was largely made and received by a Western audience. And so I tried to think of a film, a great film from the Bollywood infrastructure that was not received very well by a Western audience, or maybe not even known, but did very well within India. And then that as a starting point for, these guys have been around in the scene. I don't consider myself a film craftsman. You know, I consider a film to be just another kind of material medium in which things pass. You know, these guys have really gotten down under the hood, and they've been around for a while in different parts of the country. And maybe there has been South Asian representation in these different gatherings that they've been involved with, the birth of the camcorder and all that. And I'm very curious to hear whether an Eastern solidarity in this era of specificity, where I think everyone is separating off into corners even more. I'm very interested in the idea of the Eastern, and whether that's a myth, a fiction, a truth, something deep, possible, a utopia that's yet unrealized.
Well, let me push in there. I guess let's go a little deep before we come out of that. Roddy, I'm going to go back to something you said to kind of follow up on what Amit was talking about. And Tran and Spencer, like, we can make this raucous. Please, like, don't feel like, please just jump in whenever. Seriously. So you were saying that in 1991, around Some Divine Wind, you didn't feel like you wanted to use Asian American subject matter. And I feel like, that's a kind of provocative thing to say in a way. And I'm wondering, like, if you could just maybe talk us through that a little bit more.
Well, I think it was partially because my first two short films had been in the Asian American Film Festival circuit. And they didn't have Asian American subject matter in them.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the period that I became, first we became attacked together, but it was with John Mortsugu and Greg Araki. We were kind of vilified at these Asian American film festivals, with everybody saying these aren't Asian American films. Why are these even in the festival?
Mm-hmm.
Literally from the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And we were kind of like, ask the programmers who, were Asian Americans, and I think, it was really kind of strange. It was a very, very strange thing, like Greg, went to USC Film School and had done, his first two queer, feature films. They're really great. And people were like, you can't make a queer film. That's terrible. Like, you got to make positive images. And John was, had come out of Brown doing semiotics and had done Dur Elvis, which my mom was a big Elvis Presley fan, and she was very upset by that movie when she saw it. And then I had my first short films. And so, it was really like this idea of what and I think Amit's bringing it up. There was already a moment of essentialism happening at that, from the very beginning of what, is inside and outside, and there were certain programmers at these festivals that were, I think, a little bit, I don't know if they were adventurous, but they were really interested in sort of cracking it open. And they saw that there was a new generation of filmmakers that were not making, typical type of documentary family story films. And so they kind of wedged it open, it was people at VC like Abe and people at ACV like Daryl Chin and people that were involved in that festival. And, but it was very strange because it was already like, you can't even make these kinds of movies. And so that, when I heard the story of this, of what became my fictional film, which was about an Amerasian kid, I didn't know if I wanted to even jump into that. Mm. And so it really, I shelved it, but I kept thinking about it and I kept writing. And then ultimately the script is kind of also a hodgepodge of my stories growing up in Los Angeles. So it really became more fictionalized, and then integrating my growing up in, I was born and raised in LA, even though my family's from Hawaii, 5th generation on one side, 4th generation on the other. And so, like it was about the distance, or the gap of those types of things. Mm. But I do think, there was already that kind of, argument being made. I would say this to Amit's question, when the ACV festival, when I first moved to New York in '89, I was going to the ACV festival, and there was a lot more sort of cross-pollination across the board at that time. It sort of shut down eventually, but there was really, I think, in specifically in New York. I mean, when I was there, you would go to the new festival to see a Derek Jarman film. The Asian American Film Festival was the only place where you could see, Chen Kaige movies at that time. They hadn't even been getting released yet. Eventually Sony and all these companies realized there was a huge market. I went to a lot of the Southeast Asian films, but they did have certain codified audiences, but there was a lot more kind of movement where people were curious about it, but they were already trying to define what is Asian American, what is Asia. I remember, there was arguments in the Asian American ACB festival. Is a Middle Eastern film Asian or Asian? There was all these arguments already happening.
Right.
So it's,
and
it
hasn't
Roddy, stopped.
Roddy, can I interrupt you for 1 second, Roddy?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you think that was just the kind of crashing kind of infrastructure, just how New York works? Cross-pollination is kind of a natural, because, we walk places, and there's a general ecosystem in New York that I think incubates that. Or do you think that actually the Asian American community was in a different moment in terms of, I guess still figuring out what exactly it was, so it was open to more?
I think, yeah, it's interesting because the 80s and 90s are back, so everybody's looking back at this moment. I think, it was a very, kind of intense moment in the 80s and 90s in New York. I mean, you had the Wall Street crashing and burning, the AIDS epidemic, crack was full blown. I mean, there was just so much stuff going on. But I think also that got represented somewhat in the music scene and the art scene and the film world. And so there was a lot of things happening. And I think, in retrospect, and now that we're all old farts, we can say that, I think what was interesting about that moment was there was no set language to talk about any of that stuff yet. Right. There was no Asian American studies program, or, there was, nobody, so I think, if you look at the activist videos and Spencer's tapes and Tran's stuff, and I watched your short Amit the other day. You know, there was a lot of experimentation because there was not really a set language, and I think that made it more kind of lateral in terms of interests. You know, that if you wanted to see a Derek Jarman film, you would go to the New Festival. You know, I remember seeing his films there. You know, it was the only place you could see it. And I remember, and you know, I talked about this fairly recently. I remember seeing Simon Liang's first, I don't know if it's his first film, but Rebels of the Neon Gods. I went to see that at the ACV festival because I was like, what the hell is this movie with this title? You know, it's the best title I've seen, you know? So I think there was a lot of curiosity, but I think it's also people were really, you know, I think taking languages from each other. I think if you look at a lot of those films, you know, and all of them have, and certain directors have gone on, you know, in different ways, but, you know, Todd Haynes even being part of that moment, you know, like you can see a lot of excitement of using experimental film techniques or, you know, readdressing documentary forms, you know, all these different things. And so I think that's what made it kind of, you know, an intense moment. I don't like to be nostalgic about that moment because I think there was a lot of bad stuff.
Right.
You know?
Hey, Roddy, could I ask you something?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Do you think that, see, because like this is how I kind of remember stuff, was it's kind of, when you talk about Asian American media and cinema, you know what I'm saying? It's like the first organization was also NADA, and NADA is now CAM, and that was actually funded by PBS. Its primary funding came from PBS. And so what I think is sort of interesting with the time in terms of how I first met you, was that the tendency was, in terms of the form, was to make more PBS-able. You know what I'm saying? Like whether it was narrative or whether it was documentary. And I think a lot of times if I remember correctly, the people who were working in experimental or narrative, or I still remember the panel going crazy over was it John's film Mod Fuck Explosion? Just the title that somebody would submit a proposal. That was Mod Fuck Explosion, you know. And so you guys were really sort of pushing CAM, or at that time NADA, and I actually remember non-PBS-able films getting funded by NADA back then, but it was because of that dialogue. You know what I'm saying? It was because you guys kind of came in as sort of the bad boys, right? And sort of shook the apple tree a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally true. I mean, I never, let me, this always gets me into trouble.
Well, good.
You're drawing me in.
Let's do that.
You know, I applied to NADA 6 times, never got funding. And each time I wrote and said, obviously I'm not, you know, the right match. And they would send me a letter saying, 3-page letter saying, no, you're perfect, Roddy. We love you guys. Apply again, nothing, you know. So, you know, but you're right. I mean, it was the same thing with ITVS. You know, I was a selection, or I was a pre-screener for ITVS for 3 years. They asked me, they never gave me any money. Mm-hmm. And then they asked me to be on the final panel. And I said, well, you guys got this wrong. You've never given me any money. So I do think there was like unsaid, if I'm reading between the lines, I think there was an unsaid sort of, you know, playbook in certain ways that, you know, you couldn't really go outside too far. You know, I think even then, you know, and I don't know, it's hard to, it might be because of the PBS funding. Why would you give money to something that can't be screened, right, on PBS? There's no, I think that was the flaw in ITVS was right. That they funded the TV families, which Terminal USA was part of. Dottie Gets Spanked was part of that. I mean, they weren't able to be seen. So, it's like the thinking was, even though it's supposed to be an alternative sort of type of creativity, that it wasn't within that.
I'm wondering,
that pushed you, right? That pushed you guys harder, right? I mean,
well, I think we would have loved to gotten money to make something. I think we would have all loved that,
Can I poke in? Can I poke in a little bit here? I'm wondering actually, because I feel like Tran maybe is this a circuit that you were also working with? Are these stories that are familiar to you?
Yeah, I'm having serious flashback. I think I also applied to NATA and never got any money from PBS or ITVS or any of the established pots of money. Where my funding came from was the art world. And I think you and Abby also have talked about this. I remember right out of graduate school volunteering for the Los Angeles Film Forum. So my headspace, right, like being within a number of these organizations that Spencer and Roddy are talking about, but also having conversations with the Film Forum folks here in Los Angeles. And also at the same time, I was volunteering for LA Free Waves. So that's sort of like, where my hodgepodge of influences and conversations were coming from. So you had, of course, the established Asian American media, but also, and PBS types, but also like indie film, of the sorts of like, Stan Brakhage and Bruce Conner and all of those people, sort of like the American film avant-garde, quote unquote, right? And then LA Free Waves is sort of like just this new, young, exciting, energetic force that was about spreading itself out throughout Los Angeles and trying to make the sprawl of Los Angeles work, and bringing in a number of visual artists, media artists, who are doing all kinds of different practices and seeing how, right, we could like play videos on city buses or take over public access and program, right, like in program experimental shorts or just shorts in general by all kinds of makers in these kind of then unoccupied spaces. So that's sort of like, where we kind of seeped over into other arenas because the established ones were not as welcoming, I would say.
We actually have an anonymous question, but we have a question from, which is actually, it's a nice continuation of this conversation we're having here. The question is, how do we continue to encourage and support Asian American filmmakers, kind of what that means, to explore filmmaking outside of what is now considered mainstream and quote unquote good filmmaking? So a lot of the support and funding and encouragement centers around making character-driven social issue films now. So how do you continue to encourage and support Asian filmmakers to kind of not fit into those boxes that are required for funding? I leave it open to whoever wants to go with that. What's like, I'm a young filmmaker. What should I do? I don't want to just be in this box. What do I do?
Well, I think one thing. I'll say one thing quickly, if I can recall a little bit of the detail. I mean, one thing is what you guys are doing, not to bring up the dialogue again, because things haven't changed that much. And I will say this, that when my film screened at MoMA and Some Divine Wind played the second time, I went to that screening. And afterwards, there were friends of mine hanging out in the theater, and I saw this Asian American kid and his girlfriend sort of standing off, being very nice and polite, waiting around, waiting. And the girlfriend was nudging the guy, saying, "Come on, go." And this kid came up to me, and he said, "Roddy, I just want to say one thing. I went to film school, and I won't mention the film school because that'll get me in trouble again, but they owned a lot of real estate in downtown Manhattan. And he said, you know, I never knew you could make a movie like this. And he said, I went through this film program and I haven't made a film since. And he said, I just wanted to tell you that, you know, I see this film and I didn't realize you could actually make a film like that. And I think that's kind of important, you know, this idea that, you know, there's always been the thing about success, mainstream success, and wanting to get money and be able to produce things. And then sometimes, you know, you have to find your way however you can be. I mean, I've been lucky through grants, you know, and things like that. And I've had supporters in certain camps and institutions throughout my career. I've been fortunate, you know, but I think it is difficult, especially if you want to go against sort of what, you know, you perceive as what is the thing that would get you the most attention. Some Divine Wind was at Sundance in competition, dramatic competition at that time, you know, and I should have made another Asian American feature, but lo and behold, I didn't. I made a science fiction film and shot in decrepit New York. But I think, you know, you can't have regrets about those choices. And I think, you know, something I just thought of with what Amit was saying earlier, was asking about, I think also across the board, there were a lot more, I would say, interesting people in key positions of things. So I think, you know, Alberto Garcia, who was at Sundance at that time, really went off to find films, you know, and if you look at the films that played during the years he was the director of Sundance, they're quite incredible. And Cooper kept that up afterwards. So I think that, you know, there was a real sense to look around and discover stuff and support things, even if they were not perfect or unfinished or commercial or whatever you want to call it. But I think it's tricky. I think now it's easier to make stuff everybody says, but I don't know if that's true. You know, when I teach, I don't know if that's true. I think it's back to ideas still. It's never been about the means.
Spencer, Tran, do you have some thoughts? We also have one more question too, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
I think one of the things I would say is nowadays I see people following the money because documentary is so hot. I'll speak more directly to that. And if I look back at my career, you know, the first film I made, in reality, I had no business making it. It was about the fishing conflict between the newly arrived Vietnamese fishermen and the local fishermen in Monterey, where I grew up. We actually got funding because I grew up there and I was connected to the Asian American population. My partner, Vince DiGirolamo, was connected to the Sicilian population. In fact, his whole family was involved with the fishing industry. And on top of everything else, it was a hot topic. It was a topic, if people remember back then, Louis Malle was in pre-production to make a feature film about the fishing war in Texas. PBS had given Christine Choi a big grant to do a documentary called Bittersweet Survival. I mean, it was really hot. And I actually thought mistakenly that I got the money because we were good. We actually got the money because we had access, you know what I'm saying? And it looking back on 2020 hindsight, I didn't realize it at the time, but I got the funding because I was at the right place at the right time. And I didn't get another motherfucking grant for like 10, 15 years later, because I had these other ideas, but they weren't timely, they weren't topical, they weren't hot, they weren't whatever. And now, you know, when you see a lot of people, they're like, the first thing they say, my film is about criminal justice. It's like, really? It's about criminal, whoa. You know what I'm saying? Like, and there are all these catchphrases that are on proposals.
Right.
And I think what I had to learn, and it took me like, from Monterey's Boat People, it took me like 10 years to realize that you have to make something that either two things. One is you either have to know when you're lucky. You have to know like, oh, I have a story right now. It's right here. And I learned that I'm good at that. You know what I'm saying? Or, you know, it has to be something that you want to tell and you're the only one that can tell it. And that's the only other advice I could do. And because if it's that case, then money doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying? Like you can learn with all the technology and stuff, you can learn how to do a lot of stuff yourself. And so that's the thing that I would say, you know, and that's more towards documentary.
Tran or Amit, do you guys have any
I did
thoughts?
actually want to say something. Yes.
Please. It's hard to, yeah.
I mean, can you guys, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay. Roddy and Spencer, all of you actually sound like you were having just so much fun. I'm very interested in this kind of curiosity, the sense of play outside of category. I think I can just hear it in the, you know, I guess hearing you guys speak without any image, and it just sounds like an amazing era. I was too young to enjoy that era. But Tran, I wanted to actually speak specifically about art world funding versus like film world funding, and I have a similar experience with art world funding, and I was curious which avenue you felt is more rigid, or what have your experiences been like, and in terms of similarities and differences between those two types of funding as far as being an Asian American goes?
That's a tough one to answer. I mean, I think they're both equally limiting, you know, in terms of identifying as Asian American. I mean, I think you probably need, for me at least, I needed less money. And so the art world funding seemed to be more supportive at the moment. What's your experience been like? Do you find
I do feel that the art world has been less categorical, which is what I was trying to ask you about. If your experience has been the same, has been less confining, less limiting about what that might mean. The Asia part, the America part, all the conundrum within that word itself, those words, you know?
Yeah.
And I just wonder, as funding chains blur and as technology actually becomes more accessible, I wonder in terms of the future of film, where the money comes from. I mean, I'm just trying to think of how we can possibly reintroduce the sense of play and kind of this punk energy that's just like beaming off of all of you who were alive in that era for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a little heartened looking at, especially, you know, in this last couple of months, having to do the pivot to online teaching with COVID-19 and all this kind of stuff, and like having students stripped of all of their, you know, professional and prosumer equipment that, right, those of us who are teaching at schools enjoy. And also when we were in school as well, and this is getting to Abby's question as well in terms of what teaching can do to support the next generation and all that kind of stuff. And I think seeing students kind of blooming into their, you know, inventive, innovative selves, right? Like, oh, you don't have the C100 now. What are you going to do with the cell phone? It's like, okay, well, we can give you a free subscription to Filmic Pro, but like, yeah, you're going to have to work with your cell phone, or, you know, that $30 microphone from the online shop or wherever you can get it from, right? And just seeing that happen, I think they were surprised and I was surprised, because at the beginning, right, we were both kind of in trepidation about like their lack of resources. So I'm slightly heartened by what they were able to do and all of the technology that they have access to now. Like when we were working, you know, I guess YouTube came about, when was that? 2005 or so? I don't even remember. But anyways, like, like we didn't have that, right? Do you know what I mean? It's just sort of like, that kind of self-distribution, or making, you know, thinking about Sadie Benning also making sort of like these pixel vision tapes in her room. And then now, right, like all of the bloggers, everybody is making videos and distributing them online. So, I mean, I think, I don't know, I'm really hopeful for the younger generation. I hope that they are too for themselves.
So we have almost reached the end of our hour, which is kind of incredible. And I'm just wondering, maybe we've had a lot to say, so we only had 2 questions and one from Abby, which Tran, thankfully, you answered. I wanted to kind of like close out this panel, just wondering, you know, if any last words, like it feels like we've just begun, so I feel very strange like closing this off now, but I mean, tell me something. What is there anything you have to leave our attendees that we can't see with, in terms of the things we've kind of been thinking through? You know, this thing we were talking about with finance and with boundaries and boxes and just, you know, I don't know, maybe an offering for those in the audience who are either working in institutions trying to figure out, I think, you know, what you all were saying about, you know, it's not just the filmmakers, right? It's the people who are making decisions as well. It's you know, keeping kind of like a creative praxis, like in all levels and all kind of elements of the industry and of this, like, you know, ecosystem. So yeah,
I was going to just quickly say, I think I tell my students this too, trying to be positive, because they always think I'm such a downer when they ask me what I think about movies. But, you know, it's very strange that there is a familiar feeling, you know, familiar deja vu to the moment of the 80s and 90s happening now, I think, in terms of media making. It's a different problem. I mean, in the sense that there's just too much being made. It's become too easy, and so there's this massive just amount of stuff being produced. But there is a similar kind of vibe, which is that, you know, if you could make something that speaks to people, that people are looking for that again, you know, that like what happened in the 80s and 90s, you know, that sort of excitement. And I think, you know, as much as my students, you know, that when they say, oh, you know, my son had a YouTube channel when he was 8 or whatever, I don't even know what, it was editing on iMovie when he was 7 or whatever, right? As much as you have to unlearn that stuff with them, you know, I think they're realizing that they're getting bored with that stuff. They've all mastered it. They're getting bored with it. And so I think there might be a kind of punkish kind of pollination or cross-pollination that happens again. You know, I think it seems to go in cycles, you know, where all of a sudden filmmakers are in the art world and they're doing films for dance productions, and, you know, avant-garde theater people are doing films. So, I mean, it seems like that happens, and photography comes back again. So it seems to go in those cycles, and that's where it gets interesting, I think. And I do feel that we're hitting that point again, that there's a sense of that again with alternative gallery spaces and everything.
Can I ask you a question though, really quickly? We're almost out of time, but just, I get the sense, and this might be my nostalgia, so I would love for you to rob me of this nostalgia if this is what it is. But I get the sense that you all just were kind of like, you know, fuck the system. I'm not going to sell out. I'm not, like you said, Spencer, like, I'm not going to just follow the money. And it seems like that's an orientation that in so many ways is hard to find these days. It seems like so much of creation is very much for the purpose of selling. That, like, what I'm creating is a commodity. What I'm creating, like, the kind of, you know, even if it's a commodity after it like shows at an alternative gallery space, and then it's a commodity, it's like everything is kind of like the track to a commodity. And this is kind of the energy that I find to be really, really hard to negotiate. I don't know.
Well, I think it's easy. So it's kind of easy to make your first film, and if it has any kind of success, it's easy to get soft. You know. So the best advice because like with AKA Don Bonus, you know, I literally made that for 20,000, and I only was able to do it because actually Wayne Wang was the executive producer. You know, and so he actually went to Cam and said, I have this idea of giving an ordinary person a camcorder. And so they basically said, oh, what a great idea. We'll give you $20,000 seed money. And then Wayne went off and directed Joy Luck Club, and he basically kind of, you know, let me sort of run with the idea. But I never was able to raise any money after that. In fact, it was kind of like, the lack of respect and getting turned down, and I actually showed a clip at the PBS conference, and a PBS programmer told me I needed to go to film school because the dumbass thought I shot the damn thing, right? And he's like, "Haven't you ever heard of Betacam?" And he actually thought he was being helpful. And one of my whole things was after that I was like, I'm gonna get that motherfucker. You know what I mean? So is that drive to finish the film. After Don Bonus and the success of it, I actually was able to get funding. And so then you have to like really work hard to not get soft. You know what I'm saying? Because, you know, if you really want to, like the Don Bonus thing, you just push yourself. But then when you have funding, you can't think like you're the shit. You have the best idea. You have to still keep pushing yourself. And I think those are that's sort of the balance, I think. You know, just because you get a grant doesn't mean that, you know, you're going to be successful. Does that kind of make?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Just kind of like keeping like whatever your internal focus is and your internal drive.
Hungry, I think, all the time. Yeah. I think you have to be hungry. And my other thing is what I do fear is, you know, like I think it was like 4 months ago, you all of a sudden thought we're going to get inundated with like 1 million COVID films, and now we're going to get inundated with 1 million. My fear is people get real competitive in that environment. I remember when the Native American thing was going on, there was like 50 documentaries being made about the pipeline. My whole thing is like, there's 1 million stories, 1 million great stories within that backdrop. You know, you don't have, but not everybody has to tell the same story. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, totally.
Anyway.
No, this is great. And Tran, do you have any last like offerings for us before we sign off for this evening?
I'd just say by hook or by crook, just keep making work.
Yeah, just keep making work.
And just keep a practice, like develop your practice.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Are we good?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our attendees. And I guess we'll just keep keeping on. And thank you so much for sharing with us tonight, Roddy, Spencer, and Trang. Thank you. And Amit, who is no longer present, but nonetheless. All right. Everybody take care. Thank you. Bye. Yeah, stay safe. Bye.